So comparing VR and 3D printing, if you can do the thing that you want to do and make it a physical, real thing that you can touch, then that's always going to be better than some virtual thing.
Right.
Like, when do you really want, like, what is the virtual space for? It's for when you have no hope to do this in real life. So non-Euclidean spaces is a really good example of that. Unless you got some tame black holes that you can sort of arrange near you to get the effect you want, you just don't. It's not going to happen. You're never going to have that experience.
Right.
And so VR is really like that's what you can do. And so, yeah, you should choose do with the medium the thing that you can only do there.
I'm your host, Nathan Toops, and this is the Functionally Imperative Podcast. Today, my guest is Henry Segerman. He's an associate professor in mathematics at Oklahoma State University who does research in three-dimensional geometry and topology. I first discovered Henry's work 7 years ago when I stumbled across his video on non-Euclidean space and virtual reality. His YouTube channel has garnered more than 20 million views for his engaging and mind-bending 3D printed and VR mathematics content, and I highly recommend it. Today, we touched on a wide range of topics, from balancing academic and creative work to Second Life, Aphantasia, and even the past, present, and future of the internet. It was a fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as well. I'm going to hop right in. I hopefully this will be like a good icebreaker, but we'll get right into it. So technology plays a significant role in the creations that you share on YouTube. Especially in 3D printing, virtual reality, the stuff that you build and share.
Pretty much everything, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of people sort of in the math art community, there are a lot of people who really like to get down with their hands and their carving in wood or their, fiber arts, all that kind of stuff. And that always I think it's cool, but I don't want anything to do with it. I just want the computer to do everything. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Well, I guess my question then is, how do you see this evolving relationship? Because you seem to really have embraced, especially 3D printing.
Yeah, I don't know. When there's a technology that's relatively new and that people haven't sort of mined everything out, then there's opportunities to find something that hasn't been done. And if you're going to be an artist and you're going to be painting things, you're following a tradition that's thousands of years old, and it's not so easy maybe to find something that really hasn't been done. Depending on, a lot of it's sort of like what kind of thing you're trying to do. But I'm often, and there's aesthetic choices there. But I'm often, is there something you can. Right. Is there something you can show? Is there something that you can make happen that is really, really different that people haven't seen before, or maybe haven't seen in that context? And then working in a new space is a lot easier, right? There's low hanging fruit that there's not going to be there if you're in a really old and well established field.
Yeah, that's really neat. I think you actually your creations, especially with 3D printing, changed my perspective on 3D printing. I think. Before I saw, and I guess maybe it's your mathematical approach. Maybe it's this idea that you I feel like a lot of mathematics, especially, is dealing with these very abstract ideas, and you seem to have this very interesting way of taking something and turning it to something tangible. There must have been a journey here. Like, what was the first time that you were like, I think I could do this with a 3D printer? That was kind of an aha moment.
I sort of didn't really start with, so the first, I'm trying to remember exactly when it was. So Shapeways, I used Shapeways as an online 3D printing service for many, many years before I got my own 3D printer. And I think I signed up for them in 2008 when they just started. I don't know. I saw it online somewhere, and here's this service you can use. And desktop 3D printers weren't anywhere near. I don't know if they even were available at all back then. But yeah, so I signed up for it, and then I don't think I did anything for a year, or maybe even longer, until. It wasn't even my design. It was just the first thing I printed was there was a piece of software I think called Knotplot, which is for drawing nice pictures of mathematical knots, like 3D, you know, right. I mean, you can draw a knot on a piece of paper with the overs and unders, but like having it in 3D and it was like using sort of it was using some energy minimizing stuff to get it to look like a really nicely shaped knot.
Interesting.
And there was an export from there to an STL 3D printing file, and so I said, all right, well, I'll do one of those. That was the first 3D print I ever made. And it wasn't my design, right? I was just like, let's just try it. And it actually took quite a bit longer before I really started getting into making my own stuff, and that required having the software and I guess there's a story even before there, which maybe we get into. I was designing stuff in 3D before I was using a proper CAD program, a proper 3D design program, because I was in Second Life, which was
Wow.
an ancient thing back in it's still around, right? This is sort of like, Meta wants to make metaverses the thing. And well, we tried that 20 years ago, and it's still going. Like all of the same issues that I'm sure are coming up now is like were happening, like I say, 20 years ago. But so anyway, so Second Life was this like online multi-user thing. I mean, World of Warcraft was around at the time, so that was the thing to compare it to. But rather than going out and fighting monsters, I think the focus was more on it being more like a metaverse, and there were sort of creation tools within it, and so you could build things, and it had a little sort of in-world building system, and you could script things, and so I got pretty into that. Again, probably around, it must have been around 2004 or 5, something like that. And so I was making stuff in Second Life, and it was sort of the same story as we were saying before. It was like there was lots of low-hanging fruit because nobody else was in Second Life making mathy things. And so it was like, well, let's try and make this thing or that thing or whatever. And it was a fun creative outlet from when I wasn't, doing my PhD. And so I did a bunch of stuff there. And so I actually had a lot of like 3D designs that were trapped inside of this weird virtual world. And then 3D printing came along, and I eventually got into the software, and then I could just sort of transfer a bunch of those things over relatively easily get them 3D printed, and then and then make them physical, and it's a lot easier to show some senior mathematician, here's this cool thing, because you just hand it to them, versus okay, download this thing and don't worry about the flying dongs, and like it was just
Exactly.
right. It just wasn't going to happen if it was trapped inside of Second Life. But once it becomes physical and it's real, and you can just show people it, then yeah, it's the accessibility goes way up. So yeah, I guess that's part of the start of the story of how I got started.
That's so fascinating. I remember I dabbled in Second Life, not a tremendous amount, but I dabbled in Second Life because it was really strange. I was interested in some of the cell shading, so that there's a way to represent a lot of 2D
Oh yeah.
visually, and it was kind of cool the hack that these folks were doing.
It was a trick, right?
Yes, it was
Like you had any object, like you imagine like a sphere or something, and then you make a larger sphere which is like transparent on the front and black on the back, and that gives you your kind of outline thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I remember that as well. So there were all kinds of cool little visual hacks that you could, it was this very restricted system, but people found all kinds of ways to like get interesting effects.
yeah, I think it was also one of the first documentaries that I watched. There was like a documentary that had come out on Second Life about sort of the first attempts at making a sort of online commerce in virtual worlds, and Linden. I think it was Linden Labs who ran Second Life, so.
Right.
They tried having their own cryptocurrency. It wasn't in like hash based like that, but it was an online currency, and
There was a currency, yeah.
it was
I don't remember if crypto was a thing back then, but anyway,
that
there was some sort of currency, and you could convert it into real world money, and
yeah. Oh, so interesting, and yeah, a lot of these ideas. I feel like all the metaverse stuff. Now I'm like, okay, I've read Snow Crash.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I've played Second Life, and it feels like a lot of these ideas are old
right.
old ideas and new framing, I guess. So
But who knows? Maybe it'll actually catch this time. And I mean, it's a similar sort of thing with virtual reality. People have tried virtual reality again and again and again since the 80s. Maybe it'll catch on this time. Maybe the technology will have caught up that people actually want to do this. But yeah, I
yeah,
don't know. We'll
my mother in law is actually in town, and she brought her VR headset, which was a surprise purchase that she had made on her
hmm
side. She loves it personally, and my daughter, the two of them have bonded because I'm hit or miss. Like I think there's some interesting novelty. Honestly, again, getting
hmm
back to your work, the non-Euclidean space, this idea that we can
right,
explore worlds that don't exist here, was one of the first times where I was like, I want a non-Euclidean space
right.
game in VR. Like I wish we could explore these, like break through these
They're
boundaries.
starting to exist. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's people doing stuff.
Um,
I think there's a point there about what you do with a medium, like if you're making art or technology, or like what do you do with this thing? What is the application? And VR, like so comparing VR and 3D printing, if you can do the thing that you want to do and make it a physical, real thing that you can touch, then that's always going to be better than some virtual thing.
right.
Like when do you really want, like, what is the virtual space for? It's for when you have no hope to do this in real life. So non-Euclidean spaces is a really good example of that. Unless you got some tame black holes that you can sort of arrange near you to get the effect you want, you just don't. It's not going to happen. You're never going to have
Right.
that experience.
Right.
And so VR is really like that's what you can do. And so yeah, you should choose do with the medium the thing that you can only do there. That's use what it can do. Yeah.
Speaking of things you can build in reality, I've really enjoyed your series on these gear
Mm.
gadgets that are
Gear
a little,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, the gear stuff that's like mind bendy. Like I even just the still image from your YouTube video, I'm like, what am I looking at?
The thumbnail. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you got to make the thumbnail enticing. That's the whole game, right? Get people to click on your video, and then maybe you'll get them to watch it. Yeah.
Where did where do you think these applications could translate into real applications?
Oh, right.
Some of these
Uh,
look beautiful in that they could probably be constructed on a very small scale.
hmm, yeah. I mean, uh, generally speaking, I don't think about this, and that's an advantage, right? Like, so right, so the pure mathematics perspective, um, as opposed to like applied mathematics,
Right.
is we're just interested in this thing for its own sake. And so we're just going to figure it out and see if we can, see what's true about it and see if we can make it work. And uh, whereas the applied mathematics perspective is much more, here's this problem in the real world that we want to solve.
Cool.
And so that's been my approach to a lot of what I do. And it's just, as I say, I don't really worry about like, is it actually useful for something? I mean, these are kind of on the side of being more potentially useful than talking about hyperbolic geometry or whatever. Because right, if you want to make a mechanism, it's actually got to do something. It's got to move in the real world. That's part of the sort of artwork, is that it has to move. It's not just like a sculpture of some gears or something.
Right.
That's a lot. This is one of the criticisms of steampunk, is that you just stick gears on stuff, but they don't move and they don't do anything. Then it's sort of like, what's the point, right? Steampunk with gears that do work, I'm all for. That's fantastic.
You're leveling up steampunk.
Right. But yeah, you want it to actually do something.
Right.
But then the goal is like, and this is another sort of maybe a perspective from pure math as opposed to engineering. Like engineering, you've got a particular problem that you're trying to solve.
Right.
And then you're like, okay, what mechanism can I build that will solve this problem? A pure math perspective is more sort of like, what are the possible mechanisms? Is there a, can you understand the space of possible things that might happen? And then within that, are there examples of a mechanism that does this kind of thing? It's just a sort of different perspective on it, which like pure math is like, it's interested in these, like you want very simple answers if possible. You want your goals. Right? Pure math is like, it has uh, there's a reputation of it being very, very complicated, but aesthetically from the other side, we're really more interested in as simple questions as you can ask.
Right.
Right. And often that's because like we just don't know how to solve anything. And you're just like, here's this space of stuff. And it's like, what's the simplest question? Can you answer that? And that's often what, that's often what people are trying to do. Anyway, so, um, just to pick an example, right? So I had a video where it's like, what are the different ways in which gears can move relative to each other? Like, you've got two gears that rotate, or you've got like a rack and pinion, then you've got a rotating thing and a sliding thing. What about two sliding things? What about a rotation and a screw motion? And then ultimately the point of that video was, what about two screw motions? Like two sort of geared objects that are both doing like a screw motion, rotating and translating at the same time. And as far as I can tell, nobody had ever thought to do that before. And again, that feels like there's a pure math, like just categorize what are the different interactions there are, make a grid, check off the boxes in the grid. Oh, there's one here that nobody's done. And it's very much, not actually useful because, right, an engineer would never want to do, like, what is the problem that this would, right, that this would be the solution to? But again, that's not the problem that I'm interested in. I'm just interested in like, can you classify? Can you find? And sometimes when you come at it from that sort of the opposite direction, you do find something that is actually useful, but nobody thought about because you needed to be going along a different path to get to there, right? You wouldn't stumble into it in the other direction.
I love that. I think there's a long history of that. I mean, I'm in the computer science, software engineering end of the spectrum. And there was a lot of these, I think, ideas that mathematicians had found interesting hundreds of years ago that have become really important. Like a lot of Euler's work, where just puzzles that he was working on, didn't know if there's any practical application. Turns out, asymmetric cryptography relies on all of it, right?
Part of that story is G.H. Hardy was he was a British mathematician. He was active around the time of the First World War, and he was a pacifist. He was a number theorist working in that kind of area, horrified by what technology had done, the sort of industrialization of war that really started happening in the First World War. And, he was like, and proud isn't the right term, but he was like, I guess, glad that his work was useless, that he was doing this number theory stuff. And then, as you say, 50 years later, crypto, it's all over, right? His work that he wanted to be useless turned out to be the thing, things that were necessary in cryptography.
So there's a playfulness that dances with the uselessness side, right? There's this idea of like the intrinsic aspects of asking these questions. When did you know that this is like, how can I do this all day? Like, how can I do this all day?
This is what I wanted. I want to be a mathematician. I mean, well, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, so there was I remember the time when I decided, okay, I want to go do maths at university, because I grew up in England, so it was maths, not math. It was either going to be physics or math, and I sort of realized I'm not that good at doing experiments, and part of the physics university, again, I don't want to work with my hands if I can avoid it.
Oh, that's so funny.
And part of doing in England, as opposed to like in the US, the liberal arts education, you're doing a little bit of all kinds of things, and then you choose a major. So in England, like, you choose the topic you're going to study at university before you apply. So I applied to do mathematics at university, and yeah, so like I was always good at mathematical stuff and physics, as long as it didn't involve experiments as well. I wasn't that bad, but I, you just don't have to do it with the maths. So I'll just go do that. And then it was sort of like, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of maybe this is true of lots of people in academia. Is just I just never got off the train from, you do your A levels, and then you go and do an undergraduate degree, and then you go and do a graduate degree, and then postdoc and professor. I mean, it's like there was never uh, it's not easy to get a permanent position doing this kind of stuff, but I kept succeeding at doing it. So I kept doing it. And yeah, I mean, I've never seriously considered what it would be like to, go and work an ordinary, honest job. And I don't know, here I am. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of weird that if you stop and think about it, that we get paid to sit around and think about these useless things. But, uh, the deal with at least the universities in the United States is that engineering departments have money. Engineering students need to know calculus, and this is why mathematics departments
Wow.
are. It's a large part of why mathematics departments are funded, and why there were so many mathematicians who are funded to do stuff is because engineering departments have been convinced that they want mathematicians to teach calculus, not engineers. So nobody catch on that maybe the engineers could teach it, but no, I'm sure we're much better at teaching calculus than engineers. So we should keep doing it. So
No,
engineers should teach other things that they're good at teaching.
this is fascinating. So, I am curious. Do you have a in your process? Are you constantly working on research papers, and then you go, "Oh, I think a YouTube video could come out of this," or have you ever had a YouTube video idea that you're like, "Wait a second, there's a paper that could come out of this"?
So I should mention, I mean, there's sort of like uh, there's different kinds of paper, and there's different kinds of research.
Okay.
Um, so the research that I was hired, to do at my, right, so I'm a associate professor at Oklahoma State University, and I was hired to do research in this. It's called triangulations of three manifolds. And there's lots of other connections to other things in topology. Would be this, or geometry in topology is the sort of broader, research area, sort of traditional research. And then I also will sometimes write papers which are intended for. So there's a big conference every year called the Bridges Conference, which is mathematics and the arts. So visual arts, music, dance, theater, architecture, all kinds of stuff like that. And so you can write a paper for that. It's a shorter thing, and it's about the mathematics behind some piece of work, and there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's a great conference. There's a art exhibition. There's a music night for people making mathematical music. There's a theater event. There's a fashion show. Like all of the things math plus some other kind of art. And so like a paper for there is much more what like a YouTube video is kind of in some sense maybe equivalent, or like very much the same sort of topic. And so I do those pretty frequently. But the actual crossover between the sort of traditional academic research and the more sort of outreach, it does happen, but it's less common.
Okay.
So like this stuff that I'm doing with gears or whatever, I mean, so these kind of things can turn into things that have sort of academic clout. Like I got a patent out of one of them. I've got another thing coming up, which maybe that'll turn into a patent as well. And if I were in a mechanical engineering department rather than a mathematics department, then that patent would be, directly related to the kind of stuff that I'm doing in my real job. But where I am at the moment, it just sort of isn't. And I'm just doing it. And, my department is happy that I'm doing it. It's fine. It's just not what they hired me for, but it still looks cool. And it helps to have a very supportive department. So there are crossovers. There was, I am planning one over this summer. I'm going to record some stuff with with a collaborator of mine in England about a paper that we're writing up right now, which is sort of like part of the problem is pure mathematics is there can be a lot of prerequisites before you can really understand what the thing is even saying. Like, what did you prove? What did you do? It can require a lot of sort of background material before you can even really understand what, and yeah, a lot of my work is trying to get things out of the abstract and make them more physical and more accessible. But even so, most things that I'm doing are not at that level, right? Most things I don't see, like you could give a lecture, and I've done it, and I could explain it given 50 minutes to an interested general public with some math background, but it's not a YouTube video. Like that's but there are some things, and when there is something, then you want to bridge that divide. And this whole thing, right? And I should say, I mean, there are things that are more closely straddle that. The whole sort of non-Euclidean virtual reality, that's been a long running project, which really has some academic chops, but it also makes things very visual and very accessible. So there are things that straddle it like pretty well, but there are also things that are just sort of too far off, and it's not really doable. I don't see a way to sort of make it into something that's super accessible. And I guess there was another part of your question, which do things ever go the other way from a YouTube idea to a research project? And or even like, once you've got a 3D print in your hand of this mathematical thing, do you understand more about it? Do you say, oh, wait, I realize now let me go write a paper? And that also is very rare. Maybe there's things like a couple of things. Part of the reason for that is that when you're in the business of making a 3D print or making an animation of something, in order to do that, you have to really understand it very well. And once I've done that, like the extra thing that you get from touching it, for me, having already understood it to the point where I could make it, is probably not that much. And so I've certainly learned things in the process of implementing stuff that I wouldn't have known otherwise. But yeah, I can't think of an example of something where that then turned into a paper which wasn't already a paper about how do I implement these things and how do you calculate stuff.
No, yeah. that makes total sense. So then this makes me wonder, so obviously you have your academic motivations. There's this mathematics communication piece to you then that really enjoys doing this. When did you know that you wanted to start doing that? Like,
that's a good question. Yeah, so I'm trying to think actually. I mean, so the sort of the reason I first got into using CAD, the computer aided design, so the program I use is called Rhinoceros, which is like a design software. And the reason I got into that is because I was giving an academic talk on some work that I was doing, and I wanted to make good pictures of the things that I was talking about. And they were really 3D. And so a friend of mine from the math art community who does a lot of 3D stuff said, well, you should get into Rhino. And so that's how I started doing it, is because I wanted to make good figures. So I think maybe like the question of like, why am I into like making the pictures? It's deeper it's deeper than the outreach. I want to make good pictures. And once you have good pictures, then it's easier to show other people. So why do I want to make good pictures? This may go back to the fact that I have aphantasia. So aphantasia is, this went around the internet a few years ago. People realize, like the question is, can you, when you quote visualize something in your mind, do you see something? Right. So let's do the experiment right now.
I also have aphantasia.
Okay. All right. You already know the story. Great.
Yeah. No. So please, I would love to hear your explanation.
So the usual story. I mean, I guess listeners can try this, right? So So think of the lowercase letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, whatever. So some of them have like a tail that goes below the line on which the letters are written. So, well, go on. What are some of those letters that have a tail that go below?
So G,
Right.
Q,
Yeah. J, Y.
J,
Okay.
Y. Yeah.
And then the question is, how did you do this? Right? You didn't write them down. You don't have it in front of you unless you are at a computer and you actually type them in. What did you do? Like, what was the experience like to figure this out?
So I can't see things directly.
Right.
So there's like processes make sense in my head. Like I actually can sort through things. So I call it drawing it out, but I can't draw it out. But I
Right.
can like move through the forms of like thinking through the characteristics, and that's how. But it's not
Right.
like it's not like a visual thing. It's like a
It's not like it appears in your yeah. So I guess we haven't actually said what aphantasia is.
yeah.
So the question is, when you did this exercise, how did you do it? And a lot of people will say, well, I just saw the letters in front of me
Right.
and I looked at the ones and I said, oh, G is one where the tail, all this sort of stuff. And so aphantasia, I don't know what the percentages are. It seems like less than 10% will claim. I mean, that's another problem with this is like, how do you know? Like, how can you tell from the outside what somebody else's experience is like? But I mean, you know, I don't, when I close my eyes and think of the letters, I don't see them. Maybe I have a little bit of a sense of motion of like I'm drawing the letter.
Yes.
And that's kind of what it's like for me. Anyway, but lots of people, like my sister-in-law apparently can be walking down the street and hallucinates things in front of her of the things that she's imagining. I'm like, what on earth? Like, how is your experience so different from mine? But anyway, yeah. So not being able to see things directly with my mind, it's really important to me to make good pictures. And so I'm sort of, a lot of my understanding what's going on with some visual thing is directly in mediation with some external thing that's showing me what the picture looks like. And so, I mean, I don't know. And this is just a story. Like, I don't know if that's why I'm so into making pictures, but this, like, right. I mean, one version of aphantasia is you cannot visualize, but visualization is what I do. Like, this is like when I got to grad school, this was Stanford, and like there are some really, really good mathematicians there. And I'm looking at the other people in the incoming class, and like, I'm not as good as these people at like abstraction, right? So abstraction is a very, useful tool. And if you're a mathematician to generalize and whatever, what is it that I can do that they're not so good at? I need to focus on that. And that was visualizing things. Again, in quotes, because I can't see anything when I close my eyes. So whatever it is that I'm doing, right, I can think about something in 3D. Like I can, again, I don't picture anything, but I can, as I'm going to sleep with my eyes closed, think about things, and then the next morning write it down, and it's correct. Like my conclusions are correct, even though I'm not seeing anything. And that's what that's what I sort of focused on in my work, and that's maybe part of how so much of it is visual, and then that leads to having visual stuff that you can show other people.
That's fascinating.
And so that leads to YouTube. I don't know.
Yeah,
Sure.
no, this is great. First of all, I've never met another person who have had a conversation with who also had aphantasia, or at least I didn't realize they did. Right? I guess I
Right.
probably met plenty of people.
Did you hear about it like on the internet somewhere, or like that this was a
I
thing?
think I was watching a documentary about, and I think it was talking about someone. It might have been. Oh, I can't remember. It was a documentary I was watching on YouTube about people who couldn't picture things in their mind, and
Right.
the way they started describing it, I realized that when people actually pictured things in their mind, they pictured like actual things and not this sort of, in my mind, it's very black, like dark.
Yeah.
And I've always just been a very like systems conceptual thinker. I love the command line, for example. Like I use
Mm.
computers, and the command line just makes a lot of sense to me. And like thinking through complex systems, I can do
Mm.
quite well. But it's not a visual thinking through.
It's not sort of spatial. It's
No,
it's
it's not
it's something
spatial.
else. Yeah.
Yeah, and
But for
so
me, it's very spatial. Everything is. Yeah, I prefer the GUIs to the command line.
oh,
But
that's fascinating.
it's spatial, but it's not. Again, maybe well, and I don't
Oh,
know enough about the neuroscience, but like you know, the different parts of the growing brain end up taking on different roles, and maybe if you're aphantasic or synesthesia, sort of almost the I don't know if it's the opposite or whatever, but synesthesia, I don't know what the word is. But if you have synesthesia and then you're relating sort of colors and tastes and all kinds of other
oh yeah,
senses to abstract objects, abstract concepts, that sort of other kind of bits of the brain that are kind of overlapping and yeah, I mean, so maybe
that's interesting.
everybody else, non-aphantasics, aphantasiacs, whatever.
I love it.
People who don't have aphantasia, they've got a sort of visual pipeline from the
Mm,
imagination. And for us, it's some other part of the brain that's doing that thing.
right.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's really interesting. Um, so mathematics and
Mhm.
philosophy
Sure.
share a lot of common DNA. Is there a driving philosophy that you come back to when you are doing your work? I mean, is there something that there's certain ideas that have shook me to my core that I like kind of
Hmm.
reach back into, and it's like a foundational principle. Is there any, are there any foundational principles that you're like, ah, if more people knew about this?
uh, I can't. I don't know that I'm driven in that way. Uh, I, I I'm curious now. What's a sort of foundational principle for you
Um,
that had that effect?
so I think when I first learned about like absurdism and existentialism, this idea
Mm.
that like meaning actually might be an emergent property, that the universe itself is meaningless. Um,
It seems obvious to me. Okay,
yeah,
sure.
I think yeah, exactly. Well, I think to a, right. But this is something that I think if you don't have this concept, there's a lot
Mm.
of things that are very confusing, right?
Oh, sure. If you expect the world to make sense
Right.
on its own, or the world is set up uh, to run a certain way, and or that there's somebody in control that
Right.
things are going to go a certain way, rather than just like there's just a whole bunch of stuff happening, and yeah. But yeah, no, I don't think that I guess if there was something that I had that was sort of like that, it would be sort of the mathematical perspective on or the mathematical approach to problems, um, which is which is about sort of classifying things, trying to you know right. We sort of touched on this a little bit before. Sort of if you're designing something as an engineer or maybe as a you know um, graphic design, all kinds of things, it's more like a kind of blank slates, blank canvas. Do something interesting, and uh, and mathematicians don't really, or at least this is my impression, is that's not really the way that things go. It's more right, it's more sort of a classification question, or I mean, I guess maybe this is one sort of way um, I've sort of thought about that is when you're trying to create something, uh, you want as few choices as possible. You want to have to make as few choices as possible. Again, I mean, that's not what happens when you're painting on a canvas. You have a choice every second of what it is you're going to do. But when you're constructing a sort of mathematical thing, you want it to be kind of natural. You want it to just sort of, fall out of very simple things that everybody can agree on if you're sort of working up from axioms. And so you don't want to make choices. And so you would much prefer to add restrictions to what you're trying to do. So people often will like, um, you know, doing art in a restricted domain can be a really good sort of creative engine. And that feels kind of very mathematical to me, that if you still don't know what to do, add more restrictions,
Mm.
add more things you want it to do, and then it becomes not a question of like, what do I put on this blank canvas, but can I solve this puzzle and find something which satisfies all of the restrictions that I have at the same time? And then yeah, I mean, right, I prefer to be solving puzzles and ruling things out. That that's another thing that mathematicians like to do, which is just not really feasible in general in like design, is say, yeah, that's not possible. Here's a proof. You cannot do this. And that once you get into sort of mechanical engineering, things are much more fuzzy. It's like, well, maybe if you found some super strong material, there's less sort of like, it's just impossible. Close that door. Go and look at something else. But that that's a fun thing that we get to do.
No,
So I don't know if that answers your question,
no,
but
that well, that still takes us in a really
good
interesting
enough. Yeah.
direction. Yeah. Um, so using this idea with constraints is when you're in this process and you're doing this, are there do you have any examples of something that has ever worked out but not for the reasons you thought it would?
Or like it had properties different from what I was expecting,
Yeah,
or
like some surprising, like you worked on something and you were hoping it'd work out. It ends up not, but there it didn't end up working out for other reasons. Like,
I mean, well, you could say, I mean, that this happens in math all the time. It's like you try and prove a thing one way and it doesn't work, but you look further and you discover some other property that has does what you need, and you shift your argument from this direction to this direction. You detour around the problem, and so on. Um, yeah, in terms of sort of well, right, in terms of like 3D printed things, a lot of what I did in the I don't know, the first 5 or so years of what I was doing was kind of sculptural rather than like it didn't move. There was no mechanism, and um, so I had a much better sense of, is it going to work, and I had a very high hit rate of like, as long as you don't have any part of the 3D print that's sort of too thin, and so like it'll be fragile, or the wall won't, or this part of the print won't print properly, then it's going to work. I mean the sort of, there aren't that many ways for a static object to fail. Okay, at the time I was using Shapeways, this selective laser sintering nylon plastic, so you don't have to worry about like overhangs and support and all the other stuff you have to deal with sort of desktop 3D printers. So in that aspect, there's plenty of things that can go wrong. But with paying a company to do that part for me, they were able to do it almost all the time. So there wasn't really much way for it to sort of go wrong. Once I started making things that moved, then things can certainly get surprising. I'm thinking of one example, which was, I mean, so I'd had this design for a long time, back to the Second Life days, of a sort of a kind of space filling curve, um, which maybe I should just describe just a little bit, or rather an approximation to a space filling curve. So imagine a cube of space, and then you have a sort of squiggly line that is going through, like you imagine lots of little cubies filling up that cube, that big cube, and then you have a line that sort of wanders all the way through the big cube, visiting every one of the little cubies. So if you imagine that the Windows pipes screensaver, where there are these pipes that are filling up three-dimensional space and they're turning by 90 degrees and zooming along and then turning again. And so imagine that, but it's sort of filling up the whole of this cube. And so I had this design in Second Life, and it's like, oh, let's 3D print it. So it wasn't super difficult to convert that over to make a 3D print. And it's still intended to be a sculpture, right? It's just a static object. And it's only when it arrived in the mail and I picked it up that I realized that I'd made a giant spring. That it's a big loop very squiggly, lots of 90-degree angles, and it's filling up this cube. And I'd always thought of it as this sort of rigid, static object, on my computer screen. But when you make that out of real material, it's such a long, there's no sort of cross supports between it. It's this huge squiggly, it's like ramen or something.
Oh,
Like
fascinating.
it's just huge squiggly loop, and it sort of kept its form pretty well, but it was so flexible. You could wear it as a bracelet. You could turn it inside out. You could do all sorts of stuff that I wasn't expecting at all. And so that was pretty cool. In terms of mechanisms, usually the way that things are not what you expect is that, like, when I'm designing a mechanism, I'm designing the parts, and then I want to animate them in my software to make sure that nothing's crashing into something else. Right? I want to be able to watch it do what it's supposed to do, and so that's usually pretty good. But then the problem is that it does something that I didn't intend it to do. That there aren't enough restraints, or there aren't enough constraints on the parts, and so there's some other way that it can do something, and then it prefers to do that than what I wanted it to do, and then I haven't had the experience of that actually being a success in some other way. There's just turned into, those are generally just failures, and there's nothing else useful that it does. It just didn't work, and
you,
and,
you you realize you need more constraints.
you need, well, it needs more constraints. It needs more. This part needs to be stronger,
Hmm.
or I need something to stop it from bending in that way,
Surprising direction.
or just give up. Right? I mean, there's some cases where, like, the movement that I want sort of relied on, like, why is it constrained in this way? It's sort of, I don't know if I can explain this in a sort of easy, simple way, but it's sort of like there's a second order thing going on. That, right?
Hmm.
If you've got, like imagine uh, a joint, like a joint between two parts, like a rotating part. Um, like if you want one part to move based on the first part, then you want sort of like, it's like the first part is rotating and it's actually moving the endpoint that the other thing is attached to, and it's going to directly do stuff. And if you have a sort of like second order, like it's going like x squared rather than x, then it just doesn't happen, and there's enough flex in the system that it jams up, or it doesn't do what you want to do. And it, right, and I'm sure that lots of these things that mechanical engineers learn all of this stuff, and mechanical engineers will also have software that takes account of, like, the flexing of materials and tolerances and finite element analysis. I've not got into any of that stuff yet, but I right. But I'm also like making small 3D printed things rather than you know cranes and giant metal structures that cost a lot of money. So it's not a big deal if it just doesn't work. Um, but yeah, maybe if I had that background, or maybe I'll get into it more. I'll sort of
Yeah.
be able to predict that more ahead of time. And but yeah, you sort of learn things that work. I'm learning like engineering principles. We've left the realm of pure math. We're just into, like, this other stuff you have to deal with to get it to work. So
That's cool. Um I always find that anytime I can put myself as constantly in this state of being a beginner in something, it's helping push that boundary in my comfort zones, and I feel like I'm very
right.
engaged. Like it's easier to find the flow state in those
Mm-hmm.
cases. Tell me about some of your work that you're most proud of.
Oh wow. Um, well, so maybe let's stick to the stuff that's appeared on YouTube rather than the pure
Sure.
math research, because it's hard to talk about. Uh, I mean, having said that, and so that there's a whole bunch of non-Euclidean VR stuff. Like, so I just really just got a couple of videos out about that stuff. Um, and back in 2019, I started working with three other researchers. There was this uh, there was a semester program at a math institute called ISERM, It's the Institute for Computational Experimental Research in Mathematics, sort of attached to Brown University. And so it was me and Remy Coulon, Sabeta Matsumoto, and Steve Treadle. And so we sort of revamped all of that stuff, all of the non-Euclidean VR stuff. And last May, we all got together and recorded 7 videos, of which none have come out yet because editing video is a nightmare. And also we had all of these grand ideas. We have green screen stuff. And so that's all going to be coming, hopefully, eventually. And yeah, I mean, that stuff I think is, that's sort of like doing both. It's like there's real math there. There's, and although it's more, maybe more the others than me in terms of like the hardcore math, it's more sort of differential geometry to figure out how light rays are supposed to travel in these weird geometries. But yeah, I mean, it's real hardcore math, but it also is very much like you can feel it, you can access it in a way that isn't there.
Is this the ray tracing paper that I was looking at?
Ray March.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, that's been a really cool project, and again, hopefully we'll.
Cool.
What, it's been like 10 months and we don't have anything out yet, but hopefully we'll.
No pressure.
Right.
No pressure.
Yeah. It's like we recorded all this stuff, and then it's like there's so much material, and we had so many like, getting 4 academics together for a week. Everything was very sort of like, okay, so we're going to have to do this in post. And so it just got pushed to post, and
of course
we recorded all of the VR motion so we can re-render the frames, but that of course requires, anyway. Yeah. So there's lots of stuff to do.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, so again, I hopefully that will come out in the next year, maybe. So yeah, I think that's a really sort of, yeah, I'm very happy with sort of how that stuff has gone. On the more 3D printing things, I guess I would like talk about so one of them was this braiding gears. So this is, you got 3 solid objects, rigid plastic objects that kind of gear into each other, but there's no frame around it. They're not sort of attached to anything else other than each other. And the point is that like you can sort of put them in a row. There's 3 of them, and you can swap which one is in the middle. And the question is, why does it stay together? There's these, what is keeping these 3 things together when any 2 of them can end up at either end of the line? And that one also took about, I guess, a year total of of trying to get this thing to work. And that was very much is this possible? That it feels like something that, well, and people often ask, well, can you do 4? And, is it possible to have 4 objects that, again, are just sort of connected to each other, and then you can rearrange them and reorder them? It's sort of like, I mean, it's kind of like what a Rubik's Cube does, right? A Rubik's Cube, you've got these different little cubies and you reorder them relative to each other. But they're held within this frame, which has a core. And I mean, it's still super cool, of course, that you can reorder them and they don't fall out most of the time. But here the idea was there's no core. And the Rubik's Cube kind of has this advantage that everything's rotating around a common center point. Whereas if you sort of got things flat and just objects on the table that somehow need to connect together, but also be able to rearrange themselves and not fall apart. If I were to like guess at here's a mechanical problem that is actually impossible, I'm not sure it's actually possible to do that with more than 3.
Interesting.
To actually rearrange. If you have like magnets or springs or like there's a little bit of logic in the parts, then I think it's doable. But just like solid blocks of plastic or parts that kind of interlink somehow, I don't see a way to do it.
Right.
So maybe here's a way to think about it. Like you imagine sort of puzzle pieces kind of fitting together and they're restricting each other's movement and so on. And so here's like a principle. It seems really difficult to restrict the movement of one part in the absence of some other part, right? If there is a part somewhere that's sort of blocking the way of something, then yeah, sure, you can stop this thing from falling off and breaking apart. But this sort of, you need like the kind of things that going in that direction require something to be prevented from happening in the absence of something else, and I don't see how to do that with rigid objects. That feels like that's impossible.
Well,
But again, it's not a proof, right? It's not a
right, not a
mathematical
proof.
proof.
It's a conjecture.
Yeah. Or I mean, what a lot of the problem, and this is true of pure math as well, is how do you even write it down in a precise way?
Right.
Like how do you even phrase that in a way that you could start proving things about? What does that even mean? I don't know. So and this is again, I sort of mentioned like pure mathematicians tend to like to think about simple objects because it's so hard to say, to prove things about complicated objects. And
Right.
I mean, I say that, and pure math has a reputation for being this very complicated thing. But yeah, I mean, we're really trying to say things about, right. I mean, yeah, this came up talking with another of my collaborators, Saul Schleimer. And I don't remember what it was. I think we were looking at some gearings or something. And we do 3-dimensional geometry and topology. We're dealing with hyperbolic geometry and all kinds of fancy stuff. But like just like Euclidean physical objects, we were like, this is really hard. Like there's some stuff going on here that is like complicated. And it's getting into that sort of engineering world of like, it's not simple enough that you can just like classify everything and know everything and just prove stuff. Like the space of possibilities gets so large that you're doing design rather than classification.
Interesting.
As we come back to that again.
So sometimes, you know, there's conventional wisdom that it's in a field that's in any sort of area. Is there any conventional wisdom in your area of study that you've bet against or has ended up surprising you? Maybe others in your field
Mm.
have bet against and been correct?
Uh, I'm thinking like, are we talking like sort of 3D printing mechanisms, or are we
Oh,
talking pure
it could
math
be
or anything,
completely pure
whatever?
math. Yeah, I
Yeah. So there isn't. I mean, I guess right. 3D printing like artistic mechanisms. I don't think there really is a field. There's a few
right.
people who
No,
do
no,
stuff.
no, no.
Like there's not a people to make like conventional wisdom. Um, I mean, I guess in a little bit. I mean, so uh, I don't know if it's even so much conventional wisdom, so much as sort of like fashion. So, what are the kind of things that people think about in this field or that field, or how do people try and prove things, or what do people think is interesting? And I think pure mathematicians like to think that they're discovering deep truths about the universe, but there's a lot of like, well, I'm interested in this because I'm interested in this, and other people are interested in it, and they like my stuff, and so they'll publish my papers and they'll fund my grants and blah blah blah. So, but yeah, I mean, in terms of like what fields people find interesting, what fields people are working in, some of it is fashion, and some of it is. There were certainly cases where a field will be like, yeah, nobody's really found anything really new in that field for a while. You probably don't want to go into that field if you're a younger mathematician because it's like dying out. Like there aren't new interesting questions, and there's still a few old timers doing their same stuff. There's this kind of thing, and that can certainly, I guess that maybe that's the equivalent of conventional wisdom of like, there's not much going on over there, and so and I don't know if I've gone against that, but again, I mean, so I sort of mentioned like the 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 thing that I can do that other mathematicians are not so good at, and I'm certainly not as good at some of the other things that people do, is the visualizing and the looking at pictures and uh, and sort of dealing with things combinatorially. So by which I mean like you have some object and you cut it up into pieces and you understand how the pieces fit back together again, and that and each piece is like relatively simple, like a tetrahedron or a cube or something like that. And those sort of that kind of way of thinking about things, as opposed to like there are many other ways that mathematicians will think about a problem. Like you can turn it into an algebraic problem somehow, right? You turn it into algebra, and then you can try and attack the algebra rather than the topology or whatever, or you know, or people are sort of taking a very different kind of it's sort of hard to find the words to sort of describe it, but maybe more uh, like a smooth geometry approach rather than a sort of make it up out of rigid blocks kind of geometry approach. So anyway, so there's different approaches to things, and the approach that I've done that I've worked on is the one that I can do that other people don't do, and that well, that I'm better at. But there's always the chance that there is no solution to this problem that goes that direction, and uh, and or maybe there is, but nobody's found one. And so, I mean, I think this is true of everybody. Like you've got a set of tools. What are the things that you want to try and attack? And maybe this is trying to answer a question that other people are interested in, or maybe it's just trying to, again, that works if you're an engineer or product designer or whatever. You have the skills that you have and you apply them to a problem that you think you have a shot at doing something about. And in pure math, and I guess art as well, you get to make up your own problems,
Right.
and decide to attack things that you can attack with your toolkit, even if it is something that maybe isn't so interesting to other people. But to an extent, the fashion allowing, that's something you can get away with as a career as well in pure mathematics, and I guess in art as well. Like if enough people are interested in the thing, then you can do it, even if it's not going to, cure cancer or make $1 million or whatever it is.
Right. What's something that you've changed your mind about in the last decade?
Oh gosh. I feel like I haven't changed my mind about much. I feel like I've always been entirely correct in everything.
There you go. Oh wow. Well,
yeah,
amazing.
I've always been right. It just happens that way. Yeah, I didn't. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, I mean, certainly there are like technical mathematical things. Like, we thought maybe there was a conjecture that maybe this is true, and it turns out it's false. And so there were certainly examples like that. But not that one would bring up in polite company on a podcast. It's too technical, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
nobody cares. I mean, although, that is part of the fun of working in a field, and like, people make advances and you're like, oh, wow, this is, you can do this, or this is true, or actually that conjecture is false, or, so that's, and it's a long, slow thing, right? Over the years, people realize, oh, you can do this, you can do that. I mean, maybe this is a little bit off topic, but right now, the thing I'm working on with my collaborator, we're hoping to make a video about over the summer, is something that I first thought might be possible like a decade ago.
Oh wow.
And so it's super exciting to be like, yes, it's true. It really does happen. You can connect these things to these things without going through those things. So that's a sort of very sort of 30,000 feet level what this result is. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's like changing my mind on something. That's something I thought should be possible. And finally, I know it is possible. So that, that's very satisfying.
Oh, that's cool.
I mean, I guess you could say, I thought the internet was just going to be great and would be a wonderful thing for society. That's always a good one. It turns out the internet is kind of scary in some ways and what it does to society.
I'm gonna push.
Yeah.
I'm gonna push you on that one a little bit
Go on,
because I think maybe we grew up in a similar internet where it's easy to be nostalgic about the sort of like the internet that the world didn't know what to do with it yet, right? I think especially in the 90s and
Usenet,
yeah,
and
early 2000s.
forums.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, even into the first era of sort of commercialized social media, which I think, is like MySpace and stuff, where again, it was adorable in modern.
Right.
in
Yeah.
modern
People
sense.
were like getting together around things that they were interested in weird corners of, some random forum.
Right.
Yeah, it was great.
And reinventing yourself in some way too, right? Like I feel like there was wiggle room for people who wanted to be different right? Or have a
Sure.
community that wasn't the physical community space that they had. And
Right. And Second Life was doing the same thing. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah. What has surprised you?
What happened?
What has surprised you with the internet that maybe you would not have believed 20 years ago?
um, I mean, I guess I didn't really sort of like. I mean, I didn't have any predictions. I don't think anybody could have predicted what social media turned into.
Right.
Um, uh, but yeah, like I don't think I had any deep thoughts about it back then of like where it was going to go or what it would be. But right, the uses in propaganda are kind of terrifying, and now we have AI and generative deep fakery and all of that sort of stuff, which is also terrifying. And you know, there's I guess just more generally, like it's a miracle. It's a miracle that society functions at all. If you think like where do we come from, and what is our sort of evolutionary background of why it is that our brains work the way that they do, like like the idea of a nation. How on earth does that work? Like we're evolved to like live in groups of like 150 people, hunter gatherer, and somehow a nation of millions and millions of people functions kind of
Right.
is amazing. And the fact that you know cars and driving, there aren't accidents on every street corner all the time. The fact that driving doesn't lead to people killing themselves all the time is amazing. Like like even with all of the people scrolling through their cell phones as they're driving, there aren't lots of accidents that
Right.
people. So there's a lot of society that it feels like we're doing the Wile E. Coyote running on thin air. There's no like intrinsic reason why this should work other than it's kind of worked in the past. And but now a lot of things are changing. So yeah, I it's we live in interesting times.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I I agree. It's also interesting. Like if you look back at the beginning of recorded history, humans have been wringing their hands about the decline of civilization.
sure, sure.
But it does feel a bit different because I, it feels different because the feedback loop is different, right? Like I feel like we always worried about power in society, but what we even define as power or like where it sits is increasingly, I, I think,
It's a bit more distributed, right? Anybody can
yeah. Well,
start up a YouTube channel and
and there's an information asymmetry that I think is growing as well, right? Like you get back to this idea of like the panopticon, right? Where
mm,
um, there's a 360-degree view of the thing that's happening in the center, but the person in the center has no idea what's happening
mm,
from the viewer. And
Truman Show. Yeah.
yeah, and so I feel like, especially with, I'm in technology, so like data brokers, nation states, the
Hmm.
revolving door around public and private sector,
Right.
intelligence agencies, these things, they are worrisome because I think on one level, maybe there are some sinister plots, but I think much like we got back to earlier, and that the universe is meaningless. I I think that there's
There-
no one in charge,
There's nobody in charge. It's just stuff happening,
right?
and
And what emergent things are going to come out of that? I think that's an interesting question,
right,
right?
and what is our ability to avoid bad futures?
Right.
So it's right. Somehow we have yet to destroy ourselves with thermonuclear weapons.
Yeah.
That's another. That's the first thing is like kind of a miracle somehow. If you think about the number of them that are around, and yeah, uh, and we managed to get through the ozone layer problem, right? So CFCs and all that sort of stuff. That was a real triumph of civilization that we could come together and say we're going to have to do this thing that is slightly more expensive, and if we don't do this, we're in real trouble.
Right.
So, or even worse, other people are in real trouble, right? and now we have global warming or global climate change, which is a much harder thing to change. And uh, yeah, I mean, depending on how things go, do we have the ability to? Do we, as a species, have the ability to make these changes, which are on the small scale for everybody, more expensive, whatever it might be? Maybe not even. I mean, there's some questions there, but you have to change things in order to, in the short term, maybe make things more complicated, more expensive, or whatever, in order to have a long term which is not disastrous. And it's like, that's a bit of an ask. That's a larger ask than
Yeah,
CFCs.
absolutely. Because well, especially because I think we're in a battle of realities, right? Like we can't even frame
Sure.
the question in a way that we all agree on. Where I think the ozone thing was pretty cut and dry. Um, at least
There was some pushback for some time. I
there
mean,
was,
the
and maybe
until the data came out, and then it became clear. But there
right,
was, yeah. I mean,
right. That's interesting.
same thing with like, is smoking dangerous? Right. I mean, the business that is profiting from this thing is going to try and go the other way, right? I mean, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I think that in retrospect, we're going to look at this modern era of social media as the cigarette industry of our time. Like I think
Oh,
that
that may be
like
in terms of mental health
well, I
and what
think well
it,
there's a lot of time and energy spent not understanding the question. Like social media companies are like, could teenagers be having mental health problems from using our platform? Like none of our research says this. And you're like, the cigarette companies
right.
did the same thing with lung cancer, right? Like,
True. Yeah.
oh, doctors prefer this brand of cigarette. And you're like, okay, well, weird framing of the question.
Right. Is the quote? It's hard to get a man to understand something
Oh, it is
if his salary
salary.
depends on not understanding it.
Exactly.
I'm sure we can change that to a less sexist version of it. But anyway, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So again, this is how humans work and how corporations work,
Yeah.
and we're here in this soup of society and technology and people, and we'll see if we manage to stay on track to some future which is sustainable or at least livable.
Yeah. Wow. I know that we've really taken this to a real
Yeah.
rosy.
Suddenly it got dark. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Um this is one I think maybe we can uh end this section here is have you had any surprising interactions with your audience that maybe influenced future projects?
Um, so yeah, back to like making fun little gadgets out of
Oh,
3D printed plastic. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, no, I mean, sure. Like, it's actually a really good source of like new ideas. It's like, whenever you put something out, people will say, well, what if you did this, or there's something that I just missed, like, uh, you know, here's another thing you could try. Yeah, that happens pretty frequently. Um, and sometimes I end up doing it, or much later on I come back to it, or it evolves in a different direction. Yeah, that's
that's great. Well, see, so
yeah.
maybe you're helping cultivate this part of the internet that's the one we need to keep, right?
I, I should mention. I mean, there is and this is something about the YouTube algorithm, whatever. The most interesting comments will come in the first few days, and the less interesting comments will come in later. And something to do with how YouTube, how YouTube decide what is the audience, right? There's some hardcore of people who are, actually subscribed, who are actually going to click on it initially, that are more engaged in, what's going on, and will have sort of, real things to say. And then later on, there's a lot of other people who, I guess, it's the as the circle of like, what who are we going to show this thing to? The YouTube algorithm says, oh, maybe these people will find it interesting as well. And it gets wider and wider, and often it's not always, there'll be good comments to come through, but there was a lot
There's
of
like,
like,
bro,
at
what
some
did I
point,
just see? What did I 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 just see?
sure, I mean, or, you know, every fifth comment is essentially the same joke. It happens. Um, um, and I guess that's great for the YouTube engagement that people are commenting, but it's not, from a like, is this really engaging with what it is? It's there's less stuff going on, but so it goes. It's not that I'm complaining that people are watching it. Maybe I guess that's the other thing is the people commenting versus the people watching. They're not necessarily the same. Like the average person in each of those groups is not necessarily the same thing.
Right.
And you can do something that's inspiring to people, even if they're not understanding it to a high level, or maybe just all of the maybe all of the not so good commenters are really just spam bots. That's also possible.
Oh,
Maybe
interesting.
maybe YouTube. Who knows, right? I mean, hard to know.
Do you try to read all the comments?
I often, yeah. I mean, it's uh, being a uh, white male with a foreign accent that's one of the good ones. Like I have many advantages over a lot of other people putting content out on the internet. So I tend not to get the don't read the comments. There still are some, and uh, and I think it is worth spending a little bit of time cleaning up things which are just not appropriate to have under a video like that.
Right.
I don't want to see under a video that I make. And yeah, on the whole, I think the positive comments are much there's a much greater number of those than anything that's sort of objectionable. But stuff happens. It's the internet.
Yeah. Ooh, it's the internet.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
YouTubers that you think people should subscribe to? What are some of your?
Oh, sure.
I'm putting you on the spot all of a sudden, and I know you're gonna forget.
Matt,
So
Matt Parker, Numberphile.
yeah.
There's a some classic mathy content which is good, and I suspect that anybody who's subscribed to me already knows who these people are.
Right.
Vi Hart hasn't done. She's still doing stuff, and hasn't been so active in the past few years. But Vi is amazing and astonishing, and just a thinker in a way that she's a very unusual thinker. Like just her perspectives on things is Anyway, Steve Mould does a lot of very cool stuff.
Yeah, like
I mean, there's a lot of. I think on the whole, like a lot of people get notice and their channel blows up because it's good content, and generally speaking, I think the wisdom of the crowd is pretty good at saying this is good content, and and it gets seen more. I'm just trying to think if there's any like small channels that I follow that well, nothing is coming to mind right this second.
it's all good.
I mean that's the other. I mean, that's the other thing is like once you get more success, then you're encouraged to make more stuff.
Right.
And it's hard to keep. Well, it depends what your motivation is for why you're putting stuff out on YouTube. If it's to make money, then that's going to be it's tough to do if you're a small creator starting out. I think most people will tell you that at least initially it's probably not a great idea to go into it saying, "Oh, I'm going to make lots of advertising revenue," and then you do it because you've got something you want to say or something you want to show, and then if money comes later, then that's great. But yeah, I mean, the flip side of it is that it's difficult to find the time to do stuff. You've got another a job that isn't YouTube on the side. So
Right. Someone who maybe is getting started doing, either math or building interesting devices and wants to start a
making
YouTube
stuff.
channel.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to them?
I mean, the sort of obvious advice is, well, do it. Like, um, uh, um, I mean, I think maybe I could give some sort of um, advice that's a little bit less um, usual, or at least something that's worked for me, is to be doing well. I mean, okay, it's a simple thing to say: do original things, do things that haven't been done before. I mean,
Right.
great, yeah, you sure. Um, if you're on the treadmill of content creation, that's not necessarily so easy to do. I mean, you know, there are I guess there are people who do it. Like I'm thinking like Stuff Made Here,
Hmm.
doing like really amazing sort of engineering stuff.
Right.
Like, well, he's got a lot of skills. I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of toys to play with, and obviously that helps. Um, but one way to do stuff um, is to have sort of like you want to have some sort of like unusual expertise if you can, right?
Right.
Um, and again, I mean, you know, uh, maybe this isn't great advice because you know having been a professional mathematician for 20 years helps with that side of how I know what to do. But maybe another way to say it is like if there is some other side of you that you know that you're reasonably good at, can you combine it with this other thing?
Yeah.
That it's much easier to find something that's new that hasn't been done to death if you're sort of drawing from two different sides of your expertise.
Right.
Um, you know, if you can do something that's uh, right, that if you're just in one field, then everybody in that field knows all of the tricks, and it's difficult to come up with something that's original and that's different. Um, but if you know about two things, then maybe you find some way to combine them, and
That's.
that can be something that makes you stand out.
Are there any books that you would recommend? And this could be over anything that we've talked about today.
Uh, well, I mean, I've got a book.
Oh,
Everybody should buy
actually,
my book.
yes.
No, I mean, but other than that, I mean, um, yeah. So right, there isn't a lot. I mean, a lot of these topics like YouTube and 3D printing and what there isn't a lot of like textbooks out there.
Right.
Um, I guess. Well, okay. I mean, this is just another. This could have been an answer to things before as well. Learn programming. Like no matter what you're doing, if you can learn programming, like learn Python. I mean, Python is what I use most of the time for most of the stuff, and it's easy to get into, and it's not the absolute blazing fastest thing, but if you're tinkering with something, then you're after sort of speed of programming more than speed of the program
Right.
is probably more useful. Um, yeah, learn programming. It lets you do lots of stuff, and I mean, you know, there's lots of ways to do that, not necessarily books. Um, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I feel like there were some books that really, I guess, influenced me when I was a lot younger, and these days that's sort of been taken over by YouTube, and you know, I mean, on the sort of you know society and software and you know toys and puzzles and all fun stuff like that. That's a lot of you know ways you can learn about that stuff. In terms of the pure math side, I'm reading you know papers rather than textbooks more
Yeah.
because you know you get to the certain point and you run out of text, but nobody's written this up yet, so you have to read the papers or whatever it will be, or even better, find a collaborator who already knows that stuff and then they can tell you what's going on. You
There
don't
you
have to
go.
read it. That's
Oh,
even better.
that's great.
Oh yeah, that's another huge piece of advice. If you don't know how to do something, find a collaborator who does. Like collaborate. It's more fun depending on your personality type. For me, it's more fun, and you fill in gaps in each other's you know sets of expertise, and you can do stuff that you couldn't do on your own. That's kind of like having expertise in two areas. You just find somebody else who you can communicate with. That bit's important. That you have to be sort of broad enough in your in what you're. You have to know enough languages to be able to talk to people in other areas.
Right.
You have to be flexible enough in what you know, in trying to understand what other people know. Um, yeah, that's even better than like learning how to do stuff. Is just find somebody who already knows how to do it. Yeah,
That's great
screw this
advice.
learning from books. Just
Find some people. Connect with some
find some
people.
people. Sure. Yeah. I mean, okay, but to bring something to the table, you also have to know something. So
Sure. Yeah, it has to be. You have to
that's important.
reciprocate. Yep.
Right. Right.
Henry, this was such a fun conversation. I hope you had fun as well.
Yeah, this has been a pleasure. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Wait, before we leave, I'm assuming the
Yep.
book you're talking about is the mathematical 3D printing book, or is there another book?
Visualizing mathematics with 3D printing.
There we go. We'll make sure to put a link in the
Sure.
description.
Sure.
So
And
awesome. Well,
and while we're plugging stuff, a lot of my 3D printed stuff is you can download it from printables.com, and there's also some stuff you can buy from Shapeways and whatever, all that stuff.
great. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a great weekend. And
Yeah,
yeah,
you too. It's been fun.
yeah. See you around.
Cheers.